12:01, so I think it's time for us to get started. Welcome, everybody. This is is this our third peer-centered Meet the Author discussion? I think it's the third, might be the fourth. I'm lost in this semester. In any case, today we have Frankie Condon, and we're going to be discussing I Hope to Join the Band. There it is, right there. See it? It's from Utah State Press. Any case, just a brief overview of what we're going to be doing today, some of the tech stuff. You're more than welcome if you want to join in the discussion to hook up a mic and a camera. That's fine with me, and do it that way. Or you can also just stay down in the chat box. If you want to hook up your mic, you don't have to have a camera if you don't want to, but if you want to hook up your mic, you just click on the Start Broadcasting button, and it should be able to walk you through it pretty quickly there. But like I said, you can stay down in the chat box and ask questions there. The session is being recorded. The UMIS recording person over there is the one recording it. I do not know where it is being stored. When that information comes out, I'll post it on WCenter as well as the blog, as well as Facebook and anywhere else. Another thing about the tech, if you don't like the little pop sound every time somebody enters a text message, you can click on the little button down below, or the little checkbox down below where it says sounds. And with that, I do encourage lots of questions from our audience. That's the whole point of these, is to have a discussion. I have questions prepared, and that's kind of the benefit of being the moderator, is I get to think about all my questions and ask them. But I will forego my questions to any questions that you have. But let's get started with Frankie. And Frankie, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe your work, where you're currently working, where you're going to be working in the fall, right? And maybe your writing center experience.
Okay. Well, currently I am at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I am the faculty coordinator of the Writing Center there and teach both undergraduate and graduate courses, including both an undergraduate and graduate course in Writing Center Theory and Practice. And at the end of this academic year, I am leaving UNL and moving to Canada to take a position at the University of Waterloo in Ontario. And I'm pretty excited about that. Let's see, I have a new project that I'm working on that also is I guess even less than Join the Band. Join the Band is not specifically a Writing Center book, but I do think what I talk about in Join the Band pertains to the work of writing centers. The new project is really takes me in a different direction, but one I've been interested in really ever since graduate school, when I was working on unionizing the graduate students in the SUNY system. And so the new project has to do with the radical labor movement in the early 20th century and its calls for multiracial unionization and interracial class solidarity. So I'm looking at rhetorics of race in the radical labor movement. So that's the new project. I started working in writing centers at the University at Albany when I was in graduate school. And announced really loudly that I would never, ever direct a writing center, and then promptly got a job directing the writing center at Siena College outside of Albany, and then moved to St. Cloud State University and directed the writing center there, and then to UNL. So that's kind of a quick and dirty. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, that I think gives us a lot of good information. Okay. And yeah, I always find that story of your reluctant writing centerness, directorness, I guess, anyway, quite amusing. Well, in thinking of the book, and you do explain, your motivations for writing it, in, I believe, in the introduction, but maybe just to kind of get things rolling as a discussion, what did motivate you to write I Hope I Join the Band?
I like that you keep holding it up there. Well, I have been really committed for a long time to anti-racist activism in the communities in which I've lived, and that really started when I was in undergraduate school in Toronto and working with the Native Canadian Center, doing volunteer work there. And as I got into graduate school, one of the things that I thought about a lot is that I really wanted my work in the academy, whatever that work was going to be resonant with and contiguous with my activist work in the community. I didn't want to see those as separate spheres of activity. I don't believe that they are still. I think they're intimately connected with one another. And I think we are better anti-racist activists to the extent that we are working in all of the places that form the communities that we live and move in and that shape us than if we're holding anti-racism as exclusively an intellectual position or exclusively as a community activist position and not as a commitment to pedagogical activism as well. Because I've been working so long in community anti-racist activism, particularly when I was at St. Cloud State, I thought a lot about how difficult it seems to be for white folks to work effectively and productively in multiracial, anti-racist activist environments. And I thought a lot about what it might take for white people to do the kind of work they need to do to be effective and productive and contributing members of an anti-racist community. And that's really the genesis of the book.
Yeah, because and that's what was inspiring to me ultimately, because I'm reading it and thinking, okay, what in terms of, the kind of work that I do, how does that relate? And there's always that sort of, I don't want to say queasiness, but discomfort in some ways because, ultimately you don't want to be the, how to put it without sounding old-fashioned, but you don't want to be like the white savior going into a community, right? That you really have nothing to do with. But that's what I found inspiring about it. Is in a sense there's means of talking about anti-racism and working in that from a white perspective, I suppose, ultimately.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most controversial choice that I made in writing the book. It's wasn't an easy choice to make, to write to white people. And there are all kinds of complexities around that choice, ethical and political. But I have this sense still that this is a conversation that we need to have, and we need to have it in a public way so that we are engaging with one another and challenging one another and supporting one another in joining anti-racist movements or local activist communities. And I think we need to have it publicly with people of color in the room with us, literally or figuratively. If only because for too long I think we've relied on people of color to teach us. And my own sense, and if you think about this in terms of reconciliation, is that that we need to take responsibility for educating ourselves and be open to the challenges that people of color might mount to us as we take that responsibility to push us further, but not to rely on people of color to do the work or the teaching for us.
Oh, we got a question from Andrew. I'm curious, Frankie, how your WC tutors take to anti-racist work? What are those conversations like?
Well, yeah, thanks, Andrew. I'm sure your writing center, like mine, has a fairly regular and rather high turnover of tutors. So in some part, the answer to those questions is it depends, right? It depends on who's in the room, and people do come and go. Um, but when I got to UNL, that writing center was really small. It was staffed by 4 PhD students, each of whom worked 10 hours a week. And for a undergraduate student population of about 23,000 and a graduate student population of about 5,000, that's not a lot of writing center support. And we have pretty systematically tried to grow that writing center. But as we did that, we tried to lay a foundation of principled commitment to the democratization of the institution, to building and sustaining a writing center that in particular was committed to anti-oppression pedagogy and anti-racist pedagogy. And so it is so much a part of the fabric of the writing center that by and large, tutors don't come to work in the writing center unless in some way they're down with it because they know it's part of the gig. It is also true, though, that there are tutors who do come to work in the writing center who become part of those conversations. All of us grapple with them. We spend a lot of time storytelling in our staff meetings, and we can spend months and months on a story that in some way orients around questions of race or the problem of racism, talking and trying to figure out what the conditions are that lead to the moment of the story, and what are the range of choices that are available to us that might make our commitments to anti-oppression pedagogy or anti-racist pedagogy actionable. Yeah, I could go on and on about that, but I'll wait for another question.
And anyone down in the crowd, if you have questions, feel free to post them at any time. We'll get to them. I do have a few more. I have some questions as well, so we can move. Another one of those. This actually relates to Andrew's question, I think, and I think it might explore it a little bit deeper. How does the book and anti-racism work in general relate to writing center theory and practice? And that question is based out of, I guess experience of discussions, people saying things like, well, what does that really have to do with what goes on in a writing center? And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so thanks, Clint. I actually have thought a lot about that question. And one of the things that I thought about as I was writing the book was how the practices, both the intellectual and the pedagogical practices of decentering, nuancing, and big here, long now thinking pertain to the work that writing center tutors do. And so one of the things that we've done in the UNL Writing Center over the years is, I told you that we spent a lot of time collecting or talking about stories. We've also collected those stories. And over the years, I've composed those stories into, for lack of a better word, sort of case studies that students in the undergraduate and graduate writing center theory and practice courses and the tutors in our staff meetings work on unpacking to practice decentering and nuancing and big here, long now thinking. So, with particular regard to decentering, for example, I think it's important, generally speaking, for tutors to be thinking about the practice of yielding the way that I believe Beth used the term in Noise from the Writing Center. So both in the sense of making way for and in the sense of getting oneself out of the way. And I think that that notion of yielding is really fundamental to decentering. So to give you an example of how we get tutors thinking about and talking about and trying to practice decentering and also nuancing and big here, long now, thinking there's an exercise that I do or that we do together. It's a kind of a fishbowl exercise. Um, so either in the class or in a staff meeting, we have a tutor and a writer sitting together, and then the other tutors or the other students are in a big circle around the outside. So the tutor starts working with the writer, and anybody in the outside circle can stop the action of the consultation at any time. And there are a series of questions that we ask of tutors or students in those classes in this fishbowl exercise when we stop them. So the big or first question most often is, why are you giving this feedback to this writer right now? And then we pursue that question. We want to know, so what theories of writing or theories of tutoring support the choice to give this feedback right now? We want to ask how these theories that are the foundation for the feedback you're giving account for tutor identity, account for the writer's identity. And we want to think and talk together about, you know, for whose benefit, in service of whose interests is this feedback offered. And those are the kinds of questions that I think attend all three of those practices. We want to get to the question of, in what ways does this feedback offered at this moment support the writer not only in the right here, right now, or within this text or the production of this text, but how does this feedback support the writer as a lifelong learner and a lifelong writer? So I guess the short version of the answer is that this is the kind of critically reflective thinking or critically reflective practice that I want tutors with whom I am working to be engaged all the time. And particularly when they are working with historically excluded or marginalized students.
Yeah, sorry, I was hurriedly writing down your scheme because I think I'm going to steal it.
Okay.
That's
So,
awesome, though. I because usually I've done it, you know, done either observations in the sense of one-on-one, you know, tutor working with writer, um, or in smaller groups, but never the whole class, and that could be an interesting, or the whole group. That could be an interesting approach. I agree.
So, quick word of
Travis,
warning about that.
yeah, go ahead.
So, a couple of things. So, one is, one of the reasons for doing that work in that way is to underscore for students in the class and for tutors that the work we do is public work, and that the teaching space of the Writing Center is a public space and interwoven with the other kinds of public spaces in and through which we move. Um, uh, but the word of warning is that it can be extremely irritating to be interrupted when you're trying to consult with a writer. So one of the things that I do is I recruit writers to be the writer in moments like that, and I make sure that they understand what's going to happen and why it's going to happen, so that they know what to expect. And I try and talk with tutors about what's going to happen and why it's going to happen as well. There's no doubt that it's a really challenging exercise, and it can feel I don't want to say combative, but it's difficult. And the dialogues that ensue from those questions can be really difficult dialogues. It challenges tutors to frame their individual practice in a public body of scholarship, but also in public discourses around identity and subject formation in ways that are hard. And rather than being afraid of that difficulty or that challenge, I really want students and tutors to embrace it, or at least to be willing to stay in it and not walk away when it gets hard.
Yeah, and I can think of several ways to stage this, or to at least work, you know, so that the writer is not, you know, doesn't become necessarily the subject of it. And yeah, I can see how that would be difficult. But Travis, going to go back to Travis's question. He asks, Frankie, can you talk a bit about how the book has been received as you've traveled?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, one of the funny things is it's really all hard to tell. Um, Mostly what people will say to me is that they have found the book stimulating and found it useful, uh, enjoyed reading it, enjoyed the writing. Um, for sure, I haven't gotten any, how could you possibly have done this kind of feedback from people as I've moved around. I think there's a lot of interest in it. And I think, when a book comes out, there's a lot of wait and see around what kinds of conversations will come out of it. So, one of the primary values that I tried to hold as I composed the book was um, I really am uninterested in writing in ways that are aimed at putting a capper on the conversation, offering all of the answers so that we can move on and we never need to talk about stuff again. That's just not a way of thinking about scholarship that I find particularly compelling. So I wanted to write a book that would be generative of more conversation, even if that conversation was critical, or to the extent that it was critical, I wanted to be part of that challenge and those difficult dialogues, just as I want my students and tutors to be. And so right now, I think I'm kind of waiting to see if or to what extent those conversations continue, um, or to what extent the book does, in fact, generate more conversation, because that really was the goal.
And once again, for those in the audience, if you've got any questions there, put them up. Or if you have anything to follow up on as well, for any of your or any points that are made, please post that. I've got another question here that I'm thinking in terms of I don't remember which. I think it's probably the third or the fourth chapter. You start dealing with institutional racism, and you talk about individuals as well. But just what do you think what's the difference ultimately between individual racism, or whatever we want to call it, and institutional racism, and what's the problem of it seems like quite well, it seems like a rather notable phenomenon that oftentimes racism is always pinned on individuals and always said, oh, that person's racist, um, as if it's some sort of easy way of kind of getting out of any sort of institutionalized racism by just pointing out, particular racists or something, like politicians or something like that.
Yeah, so, well, I guess from my perspective, um, I don't know how well I've achieved this, but my intent was that the book in its entirety would be about the complex relationship between individuals and the social, between individuals and the institutional, and between individuals and the systemic. And so, in kind of successive iterations, what I tried to do in the book was to help white readers think about their implicatedness in the social and the sort of the different kinds of ideation that they might engage in order to press into the relationship between themselves as individuals or subjectivities and themselves as subjects in a social, in a system or in an institution. So when you think about decentering, for example, in some ways, if I were to give a quick, snappy definition of decentering, I would say that decentering engages one in seeing one's own commonplaces and common sense as strange, rather than as normal, and investigating the strangeness of one's own commonplace and common sense about who one is and how one is in the world. if I think about nuancing, I think that nuancing engages us in historicizing what might have been, or to some extent still be, our commonplace and our common senses, right? To study the social implicatedness of things about ourselves and the ways that we think and discourse in and with the world, as normal or normative, to situate those in history and to see their implicatedness in the social. And then in Big Here, Long Now, uh, forms of ideation, to think about the ways in which we might slowly, maybe incrementally, and always provisionally situate our work in both in relationship to the past, but also in relationship to a much more extensive future and a greatly enlarged present. Which sort of gets at, I think, the question that Kirsten is asking. So this, the problem in writing centers of the ways in which our work is so oriented around one-with-one teaching and around the needs and interests of individuals. And I guess for me, I see the practices of decentering, nuancing, and Big Here, Long Now as intellectual and dialogic practices that aim at the intersection between the individual and the social, and that situate one-with-one teaching of writing, in this case, within that relationship rather than exterior to it.
Yeah, that's it. I was kind of thinking in terms of what Kirsten's statement there, and the difficulty of such conversations, but it's also to some extent a matter of the silence that you talk about. The often these kind of discussions are greeted with is just nobody says anything, and is for fear of either being cast as a racist perhaps, or just maybe not really certain what to say, and that fear of being judged. You do talk about in white guilt. I think it's in the chapter 4. It's actually on page 112. You talk about that specifically, and that it's always sort of an assignment of blame when we're discussing these. And is there, I'm trying to get to the notion of why there is silence, I think, and is it that fear of being blamed for something, or is it just people don't say anything because they are blatantly racist? I'll leave you there.
Yeah. Well, I think we are, most of us collectively, really well schooled in avoiding things that are difficult, especially conversations that are difficult. And we tend to think about those conversations in really transactional terms. So if you think about the problem of difficult dialogues in a transactional economy, it seems to me that there are really kind of only two choices, maybe three choices. So one is you go to war, two is you go insane, so as to avoid ever sort of uptaking the perspective of the person with whom you're having a difficult dialogue, and the third is to negotiate. And we know that negotiation always involves compromise. And, both practically speaking and historically speaking, negotiations around racism almost always mean that the interests of people of color are compromised. So some part of the work, I think, is to imagine and to begin laboring together to enact a different kind of economy in the Writing Center. And, out of my anti-racist activism training, I'm sort of inclined to name that economy a transformational one, right? And so some of the differences, I think, between a transactional economy and a transformational one are that the necessary conditions are different. And one of the necessary conditions for a transformational economy is that the that the people who inhabit that economy agree to stay, and that the people who inhabit that economy begin to unlearn our schooling in fear of difficulty or challenge in talking with one another. And part of the way we unlearn that is by committing to stay with one another. But another way that we unlearn that, I think, is by being open and honest and compassionate enough to recognize when we look at the articulations or the choices of another, someone else who's in that conversation with us, not as absolutely strange and foreign to us and our own intellectual and dialogic practices, but as resonant with what we also think and do, right? So that we understand that when we are looking at the other, we are looking also at ourselves. Which I think I also talk about in the book, but I can't remember which chapter it's in, where I talk about the multiple meanings of pupil. I think it's in the decentering chapter. So pupil as the aperture through which we see, but pupil also as the student. And then that sort of really interesting and creative image, I think, of leaning in to see oneself through the eyes of another, or actually in the eyes of another. Yeah.
Kirsten has added something more. I appreciate this shift from transactional to transformational economy. I wonder if the ways education is more and more transactional, a lot more dollars to degrees, makes this hard.
Yeah, it does, I think, make it really hard. But the reality is it's always been hard. And I sometimes wonder whether the shifts that we're experiencing in higher education are maybe less dramatic than we tend to represent them as being. Maybe the transactional qualities of the economy of higher education have always been present and forceful, but they've been more implicit, partly because they've been more coded discursively, and partly because the populations of students inhabiting higher education are changing and are increasingly diverse. And so I think that makes the transactionalness of the economy more visible. But I think more than that, what the question gets at is the necessity for Writing Center folks to understand that we are not alone inside our institutions or inside higher ed doing this kind of work. That if we turn our gaze outward across our campuses, we're going to find both individuals and groups of people who are already engaged in the same kinds of anti-racist, anti-oppression practices that we are attempting to make actionable in our writing centers. And we need to connect with those people rather than thinking of ourselves as so isolated and always alone and doing the work. It's sort of the unwritten part of that narrative about how alone we are in attempting to do the work is that we're constructing a kind of heroic narrative about ourselves and about the work of Writing Center that isn't accurate and actually isn't really helpful, right? So we need to go outside our writing centers and find other people on our campuses and across higher ed who are also doing this work and collaborate with them. And we need to collaborate with them in service, I think, of calling our institutions to those principles that they articulate as values for the institution, but don't often seem committed to actually making real. So some of that is faculty development work. Some of that work is working closely with administrators. Some of that work is connecting with student groups on campus who are already concerned, already activist. And so we need to move outside our centers, I guess, is what I think.
Yeah, and that's certainly one area of interest for me, because in our community writing center, oftentimes, we work with community groups, and there is always, or at least there was initially, a great deal of resistance from other groups because oftentimes higher education has just come into a group and they're going to fix all the problems. And one of the great things that our community writing center directors, Tiffany Ralscope and Andrea Maloof is continuing that as the new director, is that instead of that attitude of like, oh, we're going to come in and fix you or something, we're going to partner with you or we're going to work with you. We have experience and knowledge. We can work together in many of these issues. That's a sort of corollary in some ways, is if we see ourselves as the experts or we see ourselves as the hero in some ways, that hero narrative you're talking about, we do create problems because not everybody wants a hero. Not everybody wants somebody to come in and save them. And in fact, maybe we need to, again, as you say, start looking at ourselves. But Andrew has a good question. He prefaces it with, to dovetail on the transformational thread, Frankie, earlier you mentioned building a WC with principled commitments. Could you describe how you worked, how that worked, or I guess how that worked at UNL, or what you're planning to do at Waterloo?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things I would say about UNL is that, in when I was still in Minnesota, I was working pretty closely with Michael Dickel, who at the time was heading up the Writing Center at McAllister. And Michael brought in a couple of anti-racist training groups, most particularly the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, to do these really extensive anti-racism trainings that brought together individuals and groups from colleges and universities in the state of Minnesota, but also groups from community organizations, including the St. Paul Police Department, several churches in the Twin Cities area. And so one of the things that I took away from that really intensive training was that that anti-racism work always fails absent a public articulated commitment to anti-racism, to which an institution or an institutional site or an organization can make itself accountable. And so, one of the ways in which we have at UNL, I think, tried to develop principled commitments and then work on enacting them is to put out a mission that places anti-oppression pedagogy and anti-racist pedagogy in particular squarely at the center of the work that we do, and to make that public, and then to make that commitment a centerpiece of the tutor education that we do, both in the Writing Center theory and practice courses and in the orientations that we do for tutors at the beginning of each academic year and again in January, and then in the ongoing tutor development that we do. And so, but to pursue that a little bit further, the reality is you put that commitment out there and inevitably you have to, or you should, I think, become aware of the ways in which you fail, right? And so part of what we're trying to do is to be open and honest with one another about the ways in which we are failing, to be as clear and specific as we can about those failures, and to seek to address them. And there are a couple of ways that we've sought to address them. One is that interconnectedly, I guess, we have tried to position the Writing Center at UNL as a site for ongoing research in writing and the teaching of writing. And the tutors in the UNL Writing Center have engaged with their work and the work of student writers who are using the center to do research that orients around anti-oppression and anti-racist pedagogies, so that there's a kind of ongoing study of what's happening in the Writing Center and an ongoing situating of what's happening in the UNL Writing Center within bodies of scholarship across disciplines, from political science and sociology to composition and rhetoric and critical theory, women's and gender studies and ethnic studies, Africana studies, and so on. so that we're continually engaging intellectually and pedagogically with our own work. And then the other thing that we've tried to do to address our failures is the tutors have now formed a kind of a internal to the UNL Writing Center anti-racism group, and they meet fairly regularly, and they're trying to develop a kind of educational framework in anti-racist activism for themselves, or with my help, and then to think about the ways in which they might bring that training or that education to the larger group of tutors. So a lot of it is just keeping the conversation alive and going, being honest about our failures, and also making distinctions between kinds of failures. I think I say in the book, and I believe that this is true, and it's something we're trying to do in the UNL Writing Center. We're trying to notice the difference between destructive failures, or failures that are very difficult to learn from, and failures that are spectacular in the sense of being extraordinarily learningful, right?
Yeah, we have just about 8 minutes or so left. But yeah, if you do have any questions, again, do post them there, and we can get to them. But one thing that I really enjoyed in the book was in I guess it's chapter 5. You're making that connection with Aldo Leopold. You're taking that journey across Nebraska, and I don't know if I really have a question about that, other than I found it very enthralling, very engaging to find that in an academic text. And that kind of led me to the question, because last time in our discussions we were talking about evidence-based writing center work, and using that sort of thing. But what is the role of lore, I guess, if that's what we're calling it, or this kind of work? What does it play? How does it engage our writing center practice? How does it, I don't know, push us forward in ways that perhaps so-called evidence-based stuff, and I use that term so-called, evidence-based work alone does not?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Without sounding, I hope, too cynical or mean or something, on one hand, I have a tremendous amount of respect for data-driven research. On the other hand, I am really conscious of the ways in which data-driven research raises the question of what counts as evidence and for whom. And I'm really interested in, there's a terrific book by a woman named Samantha Power, which is actually about genocide, and in particular the genocide in Rwanda. And one of the things that Power says in that book is that the language of public policy is so profoundly abstracted from lived experience that it fails to account for the material conditions of the people's lives for whom the public policy is designed. And I think that is a phenomena that we need to be conscious and critical of in the labors that we do toward data-driven or evidence-based research. I think that there are significant communities whose knowledge-making practices are disregarded and discredited within the academy because they are story-driven in some way, and because they engage epistemologies that we tend to think of as being invalid when we view them through kind of Western imperial eyes. And I think that if we want to be responsive and accountable to those communities, then we need to enlarge our sense of what counts as evidence.
Yeah, and I think along with your book alone, I mean the idea of narrative in this work, as well as Malia Powell's work in, well, particularly her keynote address at the 2012 Four Cs. I think there is that notion of that we should be paying attention to narrative and shouldn't be just dismissing it out of hand. As if it's some sort of lesser way of making knowledge of the world. One thing that I'm thinking of is, and this is a complete side note, but the most effective sorts of information that I give administrators is not all the numbers that I pump out to them and all that data stuff. It's actually stories from students who've worked in the Student Writing Center or who've been tutors, or the things that we talked about. That actually has much more appeal to them. I don't know what that means, but here are the people who are demanding data, right? Yet they're much more affected by the stories that are being told.
Yeah, my administrators are not interested in stories.
Well,
but, that's a problem for the institution. Because, in fact, I think the institution is not making actionable its commitments to diversity. I'm sort of inclined to put the handcuffs on that, right? Or multiculturalism in the ways that it should be. And partly its unwillingness to account for evidence other than sort of a bottom line transactional economics is what produces that failure. So you can, I don't know how many of you saw this, but there's now a blog, it's UNL haters, right? Where people are making public the racist tweets of UNL students and faculty. We have a problem. And it may not necessarily be the case that problem is reflected in enrollment or in retention, although it probably is, or in the number of butts in seats in classes. It is a problem that infuses culture and climate across the institution in ways that that do harm to the learning experiences of our students, both students of color and white students.
And Travis has a question there. So then, what is the data and how that we report around issues of race and racism? I don't know if that's right, Travis, if I read that correctly.
Yeah, I don't have a really good answer for that yet. I think that that the answer that I do have has less to do with the question of what is the data and has more to do with the strategy for reporting. And so, there are people to whom we have to report, and we're handcuffed in some ways to those folks' commitments to particular kinds of data being read as intelligible and legitimate. But I think when we're doing transformational change work inside institutions, the place to start is not necessarily with those institutional sites or individuals who are most symptomatic. So in this case, those institutional sites or individuals who are most inclined to be dismissive of really important stories that I think do emerge in the context of writing center work. But to look at the web of people around those really symptomatic people and to study that web. So to look for the people who are the enablers, and then look among the enablers for the people who seem most ready to move, closest to a tipping point, and to work with them and take stories to those folks who seem closest to being amenable to change. And I think that there's something powerful in refusal. right? So, uh, you know, systems only keep working so long as we consent. Uh, and so I think it's important, even when people tell us that they don't value particular kinds of evidence that we're offering, stories, for example, to keep telling them anyway and keep insisting on their importance and relevance and studying how to tell them better.
And Andrew has the great question there. As we wind down, I wonder if you would offer some books or articles that you recommend or simply love.
Well, I think everybody should read Presumed Incompetent. I think it's a terrific book, and I think anybody who's making a life in academia should know um, about the kinds of stuff that's being talked about in that book. I think it's really, really, really important. Um, that's the one that comes immediately to mind, Andrew. I didn't think about this question beforehand, and right now I'm really immersed in reading about radical labor. Um, it's Presumed Incompetent. I'm going to type it right now. And it's Utah State University Press, again, because they're awesome. Um, but one of the things that I'm doing that I think might be really interesting for Writing Center folks to do is trying to read the work of people of color, historical folks of color who have written or spoken powerfully to the matter of racism. Um, And the person whose work I'm reading right now, and about whom I'm reading right now, is a guy named A. Philip Randolph, um, who was an activist during the Harlem Renaissance and organized the black railroad workers, the black porters working for the railroad. And so, I want to say to people, go out uh, and find people of color, scholars and activists who've written, and read what they've said and what they've done and what kind of work they did or are doing. And let's see what we can learn from them.
Yeah, and as far as this is a good time to make some connections, we'll be talking about there's Writing Centers in the New Racism, edited by Laura Greenfield and Karen Rowan, and we'll be talking to Karen and Laura next week. I forget the exact date. I think it's Tuesday. Um, but are there any final comments from the crowd, or Frankie, do you have anything that you want to wrap up with?
I can't think of anything right now, but thanks, you all. Thanks for being here. Thanks for asking really good questions.
Yes, and thank you, Frankie. Next week, we actually have three discussion sessions. On Monday, we have Neil Lerner. I believe they're all at the same time this time around. Then on Tuesday, I do believe we have Right and the New Racism. Let me go check that quickly. Oops, sorry, I'm wrong about that. On Tuesday, we have Mickey Harris and Andrew, who our very own Andrew here is going to be leading that discussion. And then the following, on Thursday, next Thursday, we do have Writing Centers in the New Racism. And I'm looking forward to that discussion as well. That's that's kind of an encouraging sign, I think, Frankie, is that we're seeing actually a lot more of books like Writing Centers in the New Racism, Everyday
Mm-hmm.
Writing Center that take on tough issues and aren't just about here's the practice of tutoring. It brings our field, pushes it much more forward.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, all right. Well, thank you all again, and we will see you. Hopefully, hope to see you next Monday, and we'll be talking with Neil Lerner. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.